Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the programme. Throughout the series we've been talking about justice and the need to stand up to oppression and trying to understand better and acknowledge the different kinds of injustices that we have in our families, in our communities and in our societies. So we've covered gender justice, we've looked at the challenges that we face more broadly in society around issues of disability, issues of ageing. And today I want to bring it back down the ageing scale to look at children and the rights of children and the vulnerabilities that children face. And I'm reminded of a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, who said in meaning, "He is not one of us who does not have mercy upon children and respect for the elderly." And again, similar to our conversations about elderly people and the importance within the religion about honouring and respecting and learning from the experience of older people, we often imagine ourselves to always be just to children. We see the example of the Prophet ﷺ, how he honoured children as well as was merciful to them, how he was gentle and kind and patient with children, but also that he would listen to them, that he treated them as human beings, that he treated them with the respect as equals, perhaps not in experience, but as individuals, as human beings. What is disturbing is the broader situation of children within all of our societies, and in particular the abuse on an individual level that we find within our homes, the attitudes within our schools to children, that of course most schools are wonderful and are environments for positive learning, but there are issues, and I'll go over them in due course, around bullying, for example, and also attitudes from some teachers that can impact negatively upon our children. And also the wider understanding of children and our respect to them is absolutely formed and shaped by broader cultural and social attitudes. In war, for example, we see children often alongside women bearing the brunt of violence. So whereas we like to imagine an ideal childhood for all children, in which children play and learn and grow and learn to love the world and love the people whom they grow amongst, we see the impact of war with children not only terrified as victims of the broader conflict, but as used in war, whether it's as human shields, whether it's as victims of torture, whether it is as victims of rape, whether it is victims of kidnap and extortion. We see terrible violence. And why do we have this violence? Because children are vulnerable, because they physically cannot defend themselves, and because they are so inherently joined to our hearts. You know, they're our precious ones, that those who are in conflict with us, those who are at war with us, know that that's a way of exploiting the broader community and of pulling people apart, of destroying families, of destroying societies by aiming at the child. So children become not individual human beings, but objects to exploit and destroy for the conflict within the conflict. So before I look at some of the more specific details of child victimisation and injustice against children, I think it's quite helpful to set the scene about what we even mean by childhood and what we mean by children. If we have a look at the varying discussions, we see from the Islamic perspective, of course, from the age of puberty, the importance of people taking their own responsibility for their own selves, responsibility for the obligations and responsibilities to avoid the sins. So from the Islamic perspective, that starts from around the age of puberty and onwards. But what's interesting, beyond the sort of religious ruling and religious perspective, are the changing dynamics of our communities and societies. So that in some of our societies, and particularly those who are economically challenged, who are not wealthy, childhood is often curtailed, or our different treatment of children is curtailed in the face of economic necessity. So children who are who have to go out to work in order to help their families survive, who have to do physical manual labour. We see children all over the world still having to work in mines, having to, a recent example, an outrageous example, are children in Uganda, for example, who have died from lead poisoning due to gold mining and the chemicals used to mine gold. So we have children exploited, and whose understanding of childhood never really existed, because they are working, because their families and communities are so poor, and exploited by, you know, the wealthier nations and, you know, wealthy individuals who enjoy wearing gold, who own gold, but whose enjoyment of a precious metal, whose use of a precious metal actually impacts not only on the experience of life of children, but on the actual life itself, causing pain and suffering and death. So we have this notion of childhood that isn't always the kind of theory that children, you know, learn and grow up in protected environments, and they enjoy and they play. The idea of playing, for some children, do not have that luxury. So where we understand the boundaries of childhood it can differ according to our situations. In the West, for example, when the nations got richer, the idea of childhood and play was extended. So the commercialization of childhood began to happen, and we have the selling of toys, the selling of the idea of childhood, of what children should be doing and playing with, developing and becoming increasingly popular idea. And then we have the other legal forms of defining what childhood is. And what's interesting about this also relates to victimization, and that is the idea of consent, and of to what extent we understand children to feel and belong and understand the world. So often when children are victimized, and particularly babies are victimized, it's because we don't see them as full human beings. When a baby cries or is in pain, there are certain ideas, for example, that babies don't feel pain as much, or that crying is good for them, or distress doesn't really affect that individual as they grow up, which of course from a medical and scientific perspective is not the case. You know, babies are full humans and feel and experience the world, although without the experience of it, but as human beings with souls, with emotion and with feeling. And how we experience the world as babies, as children, obviously shapes our psychology, our physical health and our mental well-being as we travel through our lives. And the notion of consent, for example, in the law is one that's very interesting and differs dramatically in different countries, particularly around responsibility. So beyond our understanding of the Islamic sense of responsibility and performing the obligations, we also have the legal system in which somebody is viewed as a child and therefore not able to perpetrate a crime, or is viewed as an adult and therefore treated as an adult within a criminal system. So as a victim or as a perpetrator of crime, the age of what we understand to be childhood, of consent and of responsibility can change a lot. When it comes to, for example, sexual abuse of children, this age is important because it hinges on whether someone has consented to sexual activity, or whether as an adult has exploited a child who hasn't got the ability to consent. So there are various ideas of what constitutes victimhood, what constitutes normal behaviour for a child, and what constitutes that boundary between being a child and becoming an adult. being somebody who requires support and being looked after, to that person that can be independent and responsible for themselves. So while we romanticize childhood and we like to imagine that all children are experiencing a sort of ideal childhood of fun and play and learning, what the underlying realities and experiences across the world are quite the opposite, and the rates of child victimisation of all different kinds of forms are extremely high. So within the UK context, for example, 95% of children within the UK context are considered to have been victims of some sort of crime or victimisation. And what we mean by crime and victimisation may alter. It can go from the emotional bullying all the way through to serious assault and even murder of children. So although that statistic contains a whole range of different forms of victimisation, the point is that is nearly all children facing some sort of injustice. And that is absolutely very different from that rosy image, the image that we portray on the media, that we tell ourselves, and that we like to comfort ourselves. Because the idea of child victimisation and what that means to us as a society and what that reflects about us, the fact that we exploit children and harm them, says a lot about who we are as a society, who we are as people. And it is not nice news. So the question is, what are these kind of victimizations, and what can we do about them? How can we address them? How can we make all children experience, within our powers, a positive world that will then affect them as adults and in fact shape our futures, shape the world's future? Because damaged individuals whose outlook is one of pain and bitterness is something that obviously changes the way that our world seems. The actions of people who are vulnerable and marginalised and who have experienced difficulties is very different from those who have a balanced and more positive view of the world. So before I talk a little bit more about the kinds of abuse that children face and how we can prevent them, it's important to note that the way we understand children's experience of victimisation is also important. And in particular, the constructions we make about children impact on how much we understand. So the idea that children make things up, it's a commonly held belief. And of course, children do have amazing imaginations. It's how they learn and grow up and how their brains form. But many instances where we see levels of abuse not only being high but being continuous happens because we just don't believe children. We don't believe young people when they tell us bad things are happening to them. Sometimes they are able to articulate directly what's happening to them, but other times it's about us noticing and not only believing what they say but seeing changes in behaviour. A child that withdraws, becomes very quiet, has disturbed behaviour or has a lot of anger. What are the reasons beyond that? It doesn't necessarily mean that child is a victim, but the possibilities of victimisation and understanding what's happening to that child are very real. So please join me after the break and we'll talk about child victimisation in its different forms and how we can tackle it. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, I was talking about the way that we understand childhood and particularly the abuse and victimisation of children and how that can impact not only on individual children but on our wider societies. And I think it's important to understand the kinds of victimisation because we have this idea that perhaps we're talking about beating or smacking, but actually there are different forms of abuse in the same way as there are different forms of abuse in terms of domestic violence. So for children, one of the most profoundly disturbing but also profoundly long-term damage is committed by emotional abuse. And emotional abuse is ironically some of the things that we don't always view as abuse, particularly as adults. Children are, of course, sensitive. They are not fully formed in terms of their experiences, in terms of their physical bodies, and in terms of their emotion. So it's useful to know that there are 5 identified, commonly understood forms of emotional abuse against children. And they are isolating, ignoring, rejecting, terrorizing, and corrupting. And what's interesting about the first 3, that is ignoring, rejecting and isolating, is that they're often used as forms of discipline and forms of punishment. And this whole conversation about how we discipline and how we try and guide children is often framed as punishment and reward. So that as adults we have to somehow form the character of children by essentially the carrot and stick method. That is, force them to do something by praise and bribery, or preventing them through not positive encouragement or boundaries, but punishment in the form of various types of discipline. And some of those are not necessarily physical, and of course there is physical punishment, which can range from a tap all the way through to beating. But first of all, what's interesting is the preponderance of this fashion for isolating and humiliating children. That is, trying to get them to do what they're told by making them feel rejected, by making them feel that they are no longer loved. And it's related to humiliation as well. The idea of humiliation and shame as a form of punishment, again, is very common. So as adults, not meaning to damage the individual, we try and create control mechanisms and discipline by doing these things. The idea of the old-fashioned school way of getting someone to stand in a corner or humiliating someone. Okay, it might be effective to a certain point, but there is a lot of scientific research, psychological research, that points to the damage that humiliation, shame, isolation, and rejection can have on the emotional well-being of that child. And that the way that that child sees the world and themselves can be profoundly affected. So that that child grows up feeling that they are somehow outsiders, that they are not good enough, and that their esteem is very low. And low self-esteem is connected to a whole load of mental health issues and also certain behaviours which can in fact be extremely negative. So it's something that we need to think about. To what extent is the way that we try and guide and perhaps discipline children can actually turn into forms of abuse that are profoundly damaging. Then there is the idea of terrorising. And terrorising, again, has a spectrum. To put terror into the heart of a child is easy in comparison to that of an adult. Children don't have the experience or the understanding necessarily that being regularly and very viciously shouted at or being hit can have on them. So children feel fear much more regularly and much more easily than an adult, and sometimes we can forget that. So beating a child, physically harming, hair pulling, all of these things, even the threat of physical violence, the threat that they are going to be in terrible trouble, can cause emotional disturbances within children that are not just about getting them to behave well, because really what are we doing? Are we trying to make someone a well-behaved human being, or are we just trying to terrify them and put fear in their hearts so they'll do what they're told? And the relation to that with more broadly, for example, whole populations where the state governs by fear, where groups who want power govern by fear, it's a very similar dynamic. It isn't healthy, and it doesn't in the long term promote anything positive. So we have to be careful with children. And the fifth kind of emotional abuse is corruption. And we see these forms of corruption, and we don't like to talk about them, but we see their results particularly in the perpetration of crimes by children. And corruption can come in different forms, but often around moral corruption. So it can be anything from using children within the crimes of adults. We see children being used for pickpocketing, for example, children being used in burglaries because they are small. Within the UK criminal justice system, we have prisons for children that are full of, kids around the age of 10, 12 years old who have been used to burgle houses. And they are taken within the criminal justice system, where in some cases the most support and care they get is as prisoners. And this has a profound impact on the way they view the world and the understanding of morality and the understanding of responsibility when they become adults. So if they have been groomed to be offenders as young people, it's very difficult for them to get over that as they age. Then there's the corruption we see around attitudes to women and to sexuality and to other children. So we see a disturbing number of cases that in Europe are coming to light, but are obviously across the board, where children are sexually abused and sexually exploited. And often this is by groups of people, but also by people who are meant to be responsible and protecting children, whether it's family members, members of extended families or communities, or people with authority and responsibility. So that could be priests, it could be imams, it could be teachers. So children, again, especially amongst those who are meant to be looking after them, can become corrupted by these corrupt individuals. And what that does at the time in terms of physical damage also translates into emotional and psychological damage. And we can see the profound effect that particularly sexual, but also other forms of physical abuse, has on the growth of the mind itself, of the sense of shame, of humiliation, of degradation that person can hold throughout their life. Of course, that shame and sense of violation is not the fault of the child, is not the fault of the victim, but very often that child, that victim, feels as though it is their fault, that they have somehow attracted the perpetrator, that somehow they have allowed it to happen, because as children they don't necessarily know what's going on is wrong. If it's not painful, then they don't necessarily know that what's happening to them is a form of violation and is a form of victimization. So there are all sorts of issues that as a society, the shame and embarrassment we have about such crimes, particularly against children, is internalized. So that person feels humiliation sometimes even more as they get older, and they realize what has happened to them as a child, what has happened to them by people in power around them, by the people that are meant to protect and nurture. So these are extremely important things to think about and be very wary of and speak out against, because if they're happening in families, if they're happening within communities, we need to stop them, not only for the sake of the individual, but for the sake of our own, of who we are as nations and as people. This is particularly important when those in power, whether it's religious power or political power, are involved in this kind of behaviour. Sometimes we're fearful to speak out against individuals because they are seen as upstanding members of society. In the UK, for example, we've had a number of examples, but specifically around a man known as Jimmy Savile, who was a very well-known TV personality, who was a radio and a television disc jockey, who was seen as a very charitable and important man. And because of his importance, and because people were dazzled by his charisma, although they suspected, and in some cases perhaps knew about the kind of abuses he was perpetrating against young people, disabled people, and children, he was allowed to get away with it. People were frightened, his victims were not believed. People were frightened about reporting him, so they didn't often report. And those around him who thought his behaviour was at some times strange, let it slide because he was famous, he was giving money to hospitals, and he was given access to, for example, hospitals. He was given access to some of our most notorious mental health institutions. He was given access to schools where young people who had difficult backgrounds were housed and tutored. So the example of him and his huge numbers of crimes and the way that it was allowed to happen over a period of almost 50 years it just shows the example of the way children can be victimised and the way that we can let perpetrators get away with it because of our attitudes to children and because we simply just don't like to recognise that it's happening. So I would like to just recap before we finish that the notion of abuse, emotional and physical abuse of children, including sexual abuse, is in fact extremely common. It is happening, on our streets, it's happening in our homes. And if we don't address it, and if we don't understand how our attitudes towards children can contribute to that and can actually be complicit in acts of violence and abuse of children, then it can't happen. And we need to know, we need to be able to speak out about it, we have to stand up to it, and we have to be able to report it. And force our governments, force our local governments and our states to recognise that children are victims and need protection both in the law and in the actual act of law, so that police officers have to believe children, they have to follow up cases, they have to address those in power who may be complicit or even perpetrating these crimes. So I hope this has been interesting and useful, and inshallah join me for the next programme. Thank you and Assalamu alaikum.